Hello and welcome to another edition of the BikeRadar Podcast. I am Simon Von Bromley. I'm joined today by my favourite Scot, Jack Luke, and we are going to discuss the new UCI equipment regulations that quietly dropped in a small little press release around handlebar widths, maximum rim heights, fork and seat stay maximum widths, potentially no more TT helmets in road racing, a very controversial set of rules, and why some industry insiders are absolutely furious. Let's just dive straight into it, Jack. What has happened? What are the rules? And then we'll talk about what they mean.
The key things are there's now a minimum width for handlebars. That sits at 400 millimeters outside to outside for all handlebars used in road or cyclocross competition. But crucially, they can be no narrower than 320 millimeters hood to hood. Big change. It's been very controversial. We'll come on to that. Elsewhere, rim heights have been limited to 65 millimeters in road and cyclocross competition, not including TTs, I would have thought.
No, but we have to clarify that. I mean, this is a theme of these regulations as we'll get into it, is that there's a lot of things that are apparently now banned and not a lot of clarity on exactly how these rules will be enforced.
There is also new maximum widths for fork and seat stays. So if you're familiar with road tech from the last few years and track tech for that matter, you know, the burgeoning, mega wide, very unusually shaped seat stays and forks that we're seeing on common kind of cutting edge road bikes could be put to bed. And then finally, this one's a little bit more confusing. It's not exactly clear what's going on, but there's new regulations coming in around helmets. But the crucial takeaway appears to be that time trial helmets will no longer be permitted for use in road racing. That's been a bit of a trend, particularly this year. We've seen adopted by many teams. But again, this one's a little bit vague as to exactly what's changing there. Who would have thought the UCI introducing vague rules? So unlike them.
And I think, you know, one of the kind of issues that was raised by a kind of, let's call him a disgruntled industry insider who we spoke to about this, is that these rules are going to come into effect on basically the 1st of January 2026. And so teams, brands, manufacturers have roughly 6 months to decide what these rules mean for them and then potentially develop any new kit, test that stuff, prototype it, you know, try it out with riders, and then enter into mass production, because obviously, of course, anything that is used in, you know, UCI racing has to be on public sale. So that's not a lot of time.
No, it's not a lot of time. And the kind of frustrating thing, I think, from the industry's perspective, that includes pro teams as well, is our source, who was very close to the process, said that they've been in meetings about all these new rules for ages with the WFSGI, which is the World Federation of Sporting Goods Industry, and the UCI. And crucially, they say that everything they said, all of their feedback has been completely ignored by the UCI. There have been people involved, stakeholders, if you like, involved with this consultation, but it very much appears that that feedback has been largely ignored by the UCI. And it has quite real ramifications for, you know, just from a logistical perspective, it's a huge upheaval, as Simon says. There's lots to come in terms of prototyping, development, all the rest of it. But the handlebar width thing in particular has been the most controversial move of all. We've lots to say on that subject.
Yeah, I mean, let's just get onto that right now, really. So at the moment, there is a kind of maximum or a minimum width for handlebars, isn't there? But it's something like 320 millimeters.
Exactly.
And
super narrow.
Super narrow. And there's no limit on how close your hoods can be at the moment. Now, obviously, there is a UCI rule around how much tilt you can have your brake levers, which I think is 10 degrees. So that kind of limited things a little bit. But we have seen some fairly extreme setups. And I think on the track, there was no minimum width for handlebars in terms of like drop handlebars for endurance events. And so we were regularly seeing track riders running sub 20 centimetre handlebars, for example. Well, no, sub 30 centimetre handlebars, for example. I don't know if anyone's used a sub 20 one. That would be
even extreme for you, Simon.
Even extreme for me. But I think one thing that's been, because a few people have sort of said, well, you know, it's 400 millimetres outside to outside. What's so extreme about that? It's good to limit the kind of the extreme narrowness because maybe it's unsafe. You know, why is this potentially an issue, and who would it be an issue for, Jack?
So specifically, it is believed that the new rules are going to negatively impact shorter riders, but crucially women as well. And I spoke to BikeFit James, your best pal, BikeFit James. You did a very good video.
Friend of the YouTube channel.
Friend of BikeRadar. And his view was that the new rules showed a blatant disregard for almost all female cyclists, because in his experience, he's a very, very well-respected bike fitter. He said in his experience, over 80% of women will require a narrower bar than a 38 centimeters. That's pretty kind of cut the argument short. There's really not a great deal more to be said than that. But I also spoke to Rob Lyons, who is the team manager for Alba Handsling, which is a UCI Women's Continental Development Squad. And he said that the changes are going to impact every single rider on his team. And he was at pains to say that he does have a bit of sympathy and agreement. There are some quite extreme setups in the pro peloton, which I'll come on to in a moment. But his view is that none of his riders have extreme setups, but all of them are riding bars that are narrower than the new rules will permit. Not because they've gone for some wild aero chasing advantages, it's simply because it fits them better. And going back to our juicy industry insider source, their view was that the changes will shift the demographic of winning riders to taller riders. So all of this in the favor of supposedly safety from the Safe R kind of consultancy body, I suppose, the safety organization for cyclists. That's how the UCI's put it. But in the pursuit of fairness in sport, I don't really think they've quite got it right.
I think the interesting thing for me is that the UCI has come out, as you say, they've come out and said that they're doing this in kind of favour of safety, because they are basically implying that narrow handlebars compromise your handling. But they've not presented any evidence.
Yes, quite. And it's an extreme example. And Simon, you are a very good cyclist, but you're not a World Tour rider. But
Certainly not.
But you rode with those daft 26 centimetre bars for a little while. You wrote a really good article on it. There's a good video on it.
Yeah.
I had a brief go on them up and down Simon Street, and I think it took 4 or 5 pedal strokes to be it's kind of weird.
The thing is, for me, the super narrow bars, they do feel strange. But the reality is when you're on a road bike travelling at speed, you don't steer by turning the handlebars.
It's not a car wheel. Do you know, you're not pulling it side to side.
You steer by leaning. So actually, that they don't. Yes, in theory, they would. The shorter turning circle would speed up your handling, but actually, because you tend to run them with a longer stem because they reduce your reach, that kind of counteracts that. And you tend to lean your bike to steer, not turn the handlebar. So in reality, they don't affect your bike handling all that much. Now, I can see that when you're descending, you don't have a kind of as stable a platform. And I went back to 36 centimetre handlebars, which would feel perfectly normal to me. I'm a very narrow man.
Not narrow-minded.
Narrow-shouldered, not narrow-minded, as we always say. But those feel perfectly normal to me. And I just don't understand how anyone can make an argument that those are in any way dangerous. I think the point around shifting the demographic of winning riders to taller riders is a really good one, because for a tall rider, if you're a big strapping person, this kind of narrowest handlebar could be theoretically quite narrow for you. But if you're a much smaller rider, this could be really, really wide. And so you're losing some of that advantage that you would have had from being a smaller rider that would have helped you offset that kind of power disadvantage that you might have had versus a bigger rider. And it just feels very poorly thought through.
Really poorly thought through. The interesting thing as well on the power imbalance, from a performance perspective, yes, you are losing out in terms of aero gains. But again, Bob Lyons, the guy I spoke to, was it's about comfort. Fundamentally, these narrow bars for the women racing on his team fit them. That's it. It is better for them to be on bars which are appropriate for their stature. And it feels like the UCI has just completely overlooked, women specifically have been unfairly, I'm not going to say targeted, but overlooked with these regulations. And my real gut feeling is that they're going to have to row back or clarify the rules further.
Well, let's talk about that at the end. The other thing, let's move on to some of the other rules and what they might mean. I think the maximum rim height of 65 millimeter for road events is probably fine.
It's fine. It's so unusual.
No one's riding 80 mil rims anymore.
Cool as they look, they are probably impractical for most road racing. But you are right. Well, we are right. What does it mean for TT? I genuinely have no idea.
If it comes in for time trials, I think that's going to be far more problematic, because we have seen, plenty of companies releasing 80 millimeter, 85, 90 millimeter rims. I think Aerocoach does a 100 millimeter rim, their AOX Titan. And of course,
Oh, I know
Wout
what
van
you're about
Aert,
to say. Yeah,
Wout van Aert rode a front disc wheel at the Olympics.
And it looked sick.
And it was fine.
Well, yeah, quite.
So I think, maybe it does, in that sense, maybe it doesn't matter because, a front wheel, if everyone's just riding a 65mm rim in the front and then it's kind of like, that is more of a level playing field than a handlebar thing. But again, a bigger rider might be able to argue that actually part of being a bigger rider is that they're heavier, they can handle a deeper rim, and that's an advantage. It's being taken away from them and is favouring a smaller rider. There are potentially. It's just saying, well, it's a level playing field for everyone, actually doesn't take into account how it might affect different riders differently. That will kind of remain to be seen. I think the more kind of the rule that's more likely to have an impact on how certain teams or riders ride is going to be the kind of fork and seat stay maximum widths. Now, what bikes could be banned by that rule?
Well, again, I did contact the UCI. Real journalist stuff over here, but I did contact them, for a couple questions around this and handlebar width and all the rest. They didn't get back in time for publishing last week nor for recording today. So we need to double check all this stuff. We don't have all these bikes to hand. Again, the rules aren't very clear. But we think most likely to be affected by these rules are the Hope HBT, the now iconic bike which sort of set the trend for ultra-wide seat stays and forks. The Look P24, an extraordinarily expensive and very cool bike. The Factor Hanzo Track and the IZU TCM2, the €126,000 Japanese track bike, which could also be banned. Again, this is a little bit speculative, but I don't think it's a huge reach to suggest that these could be affected. There is also, of course, the unreleased Factor Aero Road bike, which we've seen raced quite a lot at Dauphiné this past week. I don't know if that's quite as extreme as these track bikes, and you would assume, one hopes, that Factor was aware in some degree of these rules coming in. It feels quite unlikely that it would have invested all this development time. But then again, given the comments that we've had, suggests that maybe there wasn't a great deal of consultation actually taken on board by the UCI. That'd be rather stinky if a brand has just invested all that time and cash in building a bike to be like, wah, not allowed.
Yeah, and I think that kind of raises a good point where, if we've named 4 bikes here that could potentially be banned, and all of the brands who have developed these bikes and the kind of nations who, so like the Hope HBT was developed in partnership with Team GB because it's for their Olympic bikes. Now,
2021 that bike came out now.
Well, there was wasn't it 2016? No,
it was during the COVID.
It was, yeah. Sorry, they rode Cervelos. My mistake. All of these brands would have invested lots of money into these bikes, but not every nation has the kind of resources to invest in their own bikes. And actually, the UCI will say, well, we're doing this to kind of level the playing field and all of these things. That's one of the key tenets of the UCI rules. But banning something and sending everyone back to the drawing board is going to be a much bigger problem for the smaller teams who don't have the money to replace their full suite of track bikes with the latest and greatest thing. Look, for example, sell track bikes to smaller nations. And if you've brought a suite of Look P24s for the last round of the Olympics and you're a smaller nation, and now you've got to go back, and now the UCI turns around and says, no, you can't use any of those anymore. You need to kit out your riders again. And also no one else can use them, so those bikes are worthless. You can't sell them to anyone.
And then meanwhile, the nations which are better resourced, like the UK, Australia, I suppose, whoever, will have time, resource, energy, all the rest of it to develop bikes which sit within the parameters of the rules. Yeah. Go to the next Olympics with those bikes. They will be commercially available, but commercial availability rules around the UCI.
Yeah, no one else had a Hope HBT at the Olympics where it launched. We've only seen people have them afterwards. Yeah. And actually, most teams want to develop their own bike if they can at all. And the most well-resourced teams and nations will be the ones who are able to take advantage of this. And so it really goes against, I'm not saying there shouldn't ever be any rule changes, but you just have to think of the kind of wider implications of these things.
An interesting thing on this has been the reaction from BikeRadar commenters. We do actually read our comments, believe it or not. We enjoy reading them. And a lot of people have said, not wrongly, who cares? This doesn't impact me at all. I don't race. I can still use narrow bars if we want. That is true. Simon may well still continue to chip around with 26 centimetre bars. But really, from a we'll call it philosophical point of view and practical point of view, it will impact riders. People love to ape what the pros are doing, and BikeFit James and others made the point that like narrow bars have been more widely adopted because the pros are doing it. And in fact, apart from the fact they are, generally speaking, more aerodynamic, they fit people better. When Simon wrote his very good piece, like we did a bit of scratching into like, why are 40 to 44 centimeter bars like the most common spec? And the answer is that they just are. That's it. There's no like scientific rationale behind it.
It's like crank length, isn't it?
It's like crank length. There's no reason why 40-44 is better. It just is what's been done traditionally. So this sort of proliferation of narrower options, I should say, has been a good thing for cyclists. And if pros aren't doing it, they're not able to do it, there's going to be less development. It's just a bad thing overall for everybody. But as quite a lot of people said in the comments too, UCI rules do impact people who race at even an amateur level. There are, I'm sure, many people listening or watching this podcast who will be affected by this, who've maybe invested lots of money in their setups. No shame in that. If you want to buy nice bike things, so be it. And if you're going to have to completely change your setup as an individual privateer racer because of a rule which hasn't really been very clearly thought through, that's very, very frustrating. We all guffaw at sock height rules, but this one is like quite impactful. It's very frustrating, the whole thing.
And I think one of the really interesting ones is how the UCI is going to differentiate between a time trial and the road helmet. Because at the moment, the UCI's regulations surrounding helmets are incredibly lax. Basically, a helmet is legal if it fits within a box that's around 40 centimetres by 40 centimetres. And there's no, other than it has to pass all the kind of relevant safety standards, there's no restrictions on shape, how many vents you need to have, etc., etc. And that's why we've seen designs such as the Giro Arrowhead 2, which kind of extends forward, and it seemed kind of wild, and people said, how can this be legal? But it's because there are no rules governing the shape of a TT or a road helmet. It's the same reason the POC Tempur,
beautiful piece of equipment,
could be made the shape it was. There is no distinction between a road and a time trial helmet.
Which in itself is kind of a problem, maybe. But then you think, well, it's been...
How could you differentiate?
Exactly. So behind closed doors, our source claims that the UCI was pushing for rules stating helmets must have 3 to 4 vents minimum. Again, this kind of goes back to the handlebar.
What size?
What size? Why?
Does an exhaust port at the back count as a
4
vent?
holes in the
That's
back.
what I mean. If you have 4 holes at the back to let air out, is that a vent?
But then the crucial thing, which is like, again, this is our source claiming this stuff, but said that nothing that was marketed as a time trial helmet could be used. Well, you could just have a time trial helmet and call it a road helmet. Again, it's just, the rules. Maybe the UCI is going to come out, they're going to come with super stringent rules, new regulations, all the rest of it. But again, this goes back to the point, like, why was this hidden in a press release where it was like, yeah, we're going to run the World Championships, BMX racing is cool. By the way, here's these like quite fundamental tech rules.
And we're 6 months from when these rules are apparently going to be implemented. There's been a number of helmets developed in the last few years, like the Cask Nirvana, the POC one, which is kind of like half covers your ears. DSM, a guy won a Giro stage wearing a laser kind of short tail time trial helmet. But is it a time trial helmet or is it a road helmet? Where is the line going to be drawn? Because the Cask Nirvana, for example, just covers the tips of your ears. It has like a little bit that kind of comes down, and I think the idea is it diverts the airflow around your ears and just stops any kind of turbulence from that. The POC one comes down a little bit further, just leaves the bottom half of your ears open just so you can hear things. But the laser covers all of your ears like a more traditional time trial helmet and has like a visor that kind of comes around there. Drawing a line in the sand and saying this is a time trial helmet and this is not, it's really philosophical what you think. Where at what point do you draw the line? Because if you say no ear covering at all, it's kind of like no ear covering at all then, and then the Cask Nirvana ends up banned, but that is really definitely a road helmet. That doesn't feel like a TT helmet.
The crucial thing with all of this is that we believe, with no evidence, that the UCI is going to have to row back on some of this, or at the very least clarify the rules. On the handlebar width one, which is the topic we've given the most attention to over on the site, the feedback from teams, influential bike fitters, we had an email through from the International Federation of Bike Fitters or thereabouts. They were saying, like, these have to change these rules. It makes no sense, has no basis in reality. I would be astonished if the UCI doesn't row back on this. And if they don't row back on it, it is bewilderingly, I dare say, arrogant to do so, given the mounting evidence that real concerns have been ignored, but also none of this appears to be based on any kind of testing or principles. It's just, this is the rules and how they're going to be. So I think the handlebar width one will definitely be rowed back on. The TT helmet thing, I think it would just be clarification that comes down the line, but clarification that should have come out the moment that these rules were announced.
Yeah. I think that's the most concerning thing of all is that they've made these announcements without any detail on how they will be implemented. The helmets one seems kind of frivolous and it doesn't really matter. And wouldn't it be great if we could stop seeing Victor Campenaerts riding around in an original Giro Airhead without the visor because people think it looks bad. But distinguishing between a road and time trial helmet isn't as easy. It's not like, well, we all know one when we see it. Because that's not how you can run a rule book. Yeah. If they don't have, the kind of press release says they're going to develop this, I think. But if you don't have a clear idea of how that's going to be implemented and enforced, there just isn't enough time to kind of come up with those rules and then get teams to develop these new things.
Or test them. Just at a more practical level, like getting riders on new setups. If they've been riding with like 36, 38 centimetre bars for years, and then all of a sudden you're on these 40 centimetres, like it's a fairly minor change in the grand scheme of things, but like why? And why do it with such...
It just doesn't feel like this is any way to run professional sport, essentially, does it?
No. I know this is a bit like world's smallest violin. Like nobody in the comments is going to be like crying out for the poor old bike brands, but it must be enormously frustrating for the people behind these brands who have invested all this time and effort and knowledge, their careers into developing kit to then just be like, actually, now we can't use it.
And again, it goes back to that point around the best funded professionals and the best funded teams will be the ones best placed to take advantage of this. If the UCI does come out and say, this is what a road helmet can be like now, then the teams with the biggest budgets can go to their sponsors and pour money into investing a new helmet that's optimized for these new regulations, whereas the poorer riders and the poorer teams without that kind of clout and resource just won't be able to do it. I genuinely think that the UCI would love to have everyone on identical bikes, but obviously that model is incompatible with the reality that bike brands only sponsor professional racing because they want to sell bikes.
And rightly so.
So, it's like, it does feel sometimes as if, the UCI would prefer cycling to be a kind of like old style amateur sport, whereas, that kind of, what's it called? Like the Olympic spirit of amateurism or whatever. So it's absolutely mind boggling.
Lots more to follow on this, safe to say. We've written quite a lot over on the site, which you can read if you want a bit more depth into what these changes mean. There's lots of juicy quotes in there. Just before this podcast, what did you say, Simon? This was such a juicy podcast.
Oh, it could be sponsored by wine gums.
That juicy. Of course, links to that are in the pod or VOD description, however you're consuming this wonderful piece of content. And keep your eyes peeled on the site. Why not even sign up to our newsletter? Because I think there's going to be plenty more of this to come. And I will be furiously refreshing the UCI's press release page because I guarantee they will not be emailing me to tell me about any changes.
Well, I mean, again, like if anyone from the UCI is watching, please do get in touch. We would love to have a dialogue with someone about this because it does matter and our readers are interested. Thanks very much for joining us, Jack.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
If you have any thoughts, comments or feedback, you can, of course, email us at podcast@bikeradar.com or leave a comment on the YouTube video if that's where you're watching this. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.